And then I woke up December 14th, 2021, to my daughter not breathing, doing CPR, but knowing that she was dead. And that triggered another journey of, okay, there's something to this controlled grief, but it's hard and it accumulates and it's heavy. Grief is heavy. It feels physically heavy, like you weigh more than you do. Like maybe you have an elephant on your chest or weights on your shoulder. And I wish that I had an easy answer for you on how to process and relieve the pain of grief. Back in 2019, I began teaching on grief and I thought I was an expert. I have lost children, and in 2019, I started Mentally Strong, where I knew I had to teach other people how I was processing grief. My first experience with grief was in 2005, and my adopted son, Johnny, drowned on family vacation. And it was sudden and it was unexpected, obviously, and somewhat traumatic. Probably the worst thing that's happened in my life that I remember. And I processed that grief like I think every other person processes grief. You go through, you're crying, you go through their things, you feel a little down and depressed. I sent my two other daughters, his biological sisters, to a grief camp. We talked about it at church. We talked about it with our friends and our family. And then we had to move on. Shortly after, my son Reggie started having catastrophic seizures, and I had 6 other kids to raise. And so I didn't have time to do what I'm learning now as far as how to process grief. But I think we don't talk about this enough in our culture. How do you process grief? And what happens when you don't process this heavy feeling? It's very heavy. If you don't process that, what happens? So through this period of about 10 years, from this time that Johnny died to my next tragedy, was this trauma, medical trauma with my son Reggie. And I say medical trauma because at any given moment, I was scared he was going to die. So it's a fear-based anticipatory grief, which I've experienced other anticipatory grief. But when it comes to your child and you're fighting a medical emergency, it's like this mixture of anticipatory grief, but intense fear, which creates a trauma response, a fight or flight response. And I did that for 10 years. And as a psychiatric nurse practitioner, I know what cognitive behavioral therapy is. I learned to kind of take care of myself, and the things that I used to take care of myself during that 10 years, I now teach, and it's called the Mentally Strong Method. But I didn't realize how much I was going to have to experience grief. Through 10 years of medical trauma, Reggie passed away October 30th, 2016. And to lose a child, whether there's anticipatory around it or it's sudden, is one of the hardest things in the world and your life to experience. And I knew I'm a fighter. I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to figure out how to process grief. And at that point, in that first year after Reggie's death, I began to talk about what I now call controlled grief, where you actually take time to grieve. When someone first passes away, yes, you take time. You have a memorial service, a celebration. You look through pictures. You go through their things. But what about the next year and the next year and the next year? And oftentimes within a couple months, there's an expectation to get back to some sort of normalcy. And I'm going to give you some advice on that here at the end, but it's a dialectic. It's two truths at the same time. When Reggie died, I did what I now call controlled grief. Once a week, as time went on, once a month. And in 2019 is when I started Mentally Strong. And Mentally Strong is both a clinic and a brand, and I teach about mental strength in the context of our mental health journey. And when I started Mentally Strong, my daughter Maya had very controlled seizures. My husband was progressing in what we now know is our family had a very rare neurodegenerative condition called DRPLA. But I was passionate about teaching people how I was processing this grief, how I was coming out stronger in the midst of imaginable pain. And so I spent this 5 years from the time Reggie passed till 2021. And by that time, I have Mentally Strong. I'm a little proud of myself and teaching about grief and trauma and how to process and how to move on. And, in the Mentally Strong method, we separate grief from trauma and, our choices and the injustices of our life. And I felt very good about all those things being an amazing foundation for mental strength. And then I woke up December 14th, 2021, to my daughter not breathing, doing CPR, but knowing that she was dead. And that triggered another journey of, okay, there's something to this controlled grief, but it's hard and it accumulates and it's heavy. And so I embarked on what we call my 45 Days of Grief. We now have a documentary about this. It's called I'm Right Here, Mama. And if you want grief resources for yourself, for someone else, for a community agency, we are doing the documentary showing. We have a free grief course. We have workbooks. Unfortunately, I am an expert in grief. And I took 45 straight days to do controlled grief. And I experimented with all kinds of modalities to help process this grief. And I do each day, each video that I produce, I feel stronger in my claim to be an expert in grief. But I also have to remind myself of how heavy it is. So I did this 45 Days of Grief. We just finished production. We're ready to distribute. And my husband passes away. That was a lot of anticipatory grief. He was on hospice. The disease had, taken many of his abilities. And so I thought that I was okay. I did, a little bit of grieving with the family, took a couple weeks off of work. And yesterday I was asking myself, why do I feel so heavy? And I had to remind myself that grief is heavy. And, as I'm embarking on this new season of my life, and with my husband's passing, I think of what Jesus said on the cross, like, it is finished. Like that season of pain and trauma, about 20 years from Reggie's death to my husband's death. It is finished. And now I have to really do this right so that I can teach others, but do it authentic and vulnerable. And so I'm talking today from a heavy heart. In this new season of my life, I tried to hire a trainer, and I was going to be able to do my handstands and just be healthier and stronger. And then I was beating myself up because I felt so heavy. Like I couldn't find the energy to do the exercises. I wanted to eat foods that made me feel good. And then I felt like I was kind of failing. And I had to remind myself to give myself grace, and that grief is heavy. And this heavy feeling is the grief. And if I try to push through it, it will come out in other ways, including physical injuries. And so my advice to you today, when going through life, whether it is a grief that maybe you think is not comparable to mine, or you too have lost a child, grief is grief, and it's your grief, and you have to process that grief. And I have several videos on how to process grief. Today's advice is back to that dialectic thinking. We want there to be an absolute truth that, this, if you do X, Y, and Z, you will heal your grief and you will be good, strong, not depressed, not anxious. But that's not the reality of grief. The goal of grief is to process and cherish, to not allow it over a long period of time to impact your future function. But the dialectic today, and I'm talking to myself as I'm talking to you, we have to have grace and rest. When you are tired, your body is tired. And it is okay to rest, to physically say, no, I'm not going to go to the gym. But it is also true, and this is dialectic thinking, that two what perceives as opposite are both can be true. It is also true that we need to find something to do. And oftentimes our goals are so high. And in the Mentally Strong Method, we talk about personal vision, but there's also steps to attaining that personal vision. So going back to, I want to be able to do a handstand and hold it for a long period of time. And I keep thinking about that goal. And I'm 51 years old. It's a big goal for me. And then I feel defeated when I'm not making progress. And so I need to get stronger. And maybe my goal is twice a week, instead of thinking I can do it every day, twice a week, I hold my handstand for over 30 seconds or maybe 10 seconds, whatever I can do, maybe against the wall for 30 seconds so I can get more strength. And so making attainable small goals instead of, I'm going to lose 20 pounds and be able to do gymnastics again. My body is heavy, and that means I'm still processing grief. I have many videos on grief. We have playlists on it. But today I want you to watch the dialectic thinking in grief, okay? And continue on this journey of finding your strength, even in this heaviness of grief. You are mentally strong.